This computer. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this class on the I Ching, a basic introduction, or as I see it, the introduction that I wish I had when I first started studying this. So, the I Ching, for those who don't know, is a form of divination that comes from China. It has been used and informed by many different mystical traditions, including Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And I actually first encountered the I Ching when I was living in a Zen monastery. And I very much feel like the I Ching is something that I have a lot of feelings and affinity for. It's definitely a field of study that has kind of given me that tingly sense when I first encountered it of like, oh, this is for me. There's something about this thing and what I'm trying to do that is the same, which is also informed by the fact that virtually every new thing that I learned about when I was living at the monastery is now something that is super important to me and like my existence. And that's everything from like poetry to singing to ceramics to astrology and tarot, as well as this divination practice, which at this point I even feel more affinity for than the tarot. And so we'll get into how to do it, why I think it's so interesting, what sort of, divination it gives, and yeah, what is the general vibe. We're really going to break it down to its like tiniest parts and build it up. And so I can, begin to show you all the different ways you would then approach it, at least in ways that are exciting to me. So a lot of, history or more technical stuff that I don't find that interesting, we're not getting into. This is a very Chloe tinged introduction to the subject. And so, yeah, without further ado, let's get into the Book of Changes. So, honestly, I don't think I could have fully started studying the I Ching until Benebell Wen released her giant compendium on the I Ching about 2 years ago. She is Chinese and has given her own translations to the Book of Changes that is the divinatory text associated with this divination system. And then she adds in so much history and context of its role in China, the different ways to use it, and hopefully breaking open the more sort of narrow way that the I Ching has been viewed in the Western world. And I love that this quote, so as a sort of setup to how we view the I Ching, which is that it's very much about getting you in alignment with what is the way, right? What you would call in Taoism, which is, being in alignment with the universe, with yin and yang, with the great mystery. So Benebell Wen here says that the Book of Changes is both a compass and an atlas for finding your path. Just as a path is found by walking it to know the Tao, you practice the way. This is a guidebook for how to practice the way, putting wisdom into action. Right. And so this is a book of wisdom. This is a book that has actionable advice that you then use to incorporate into your life to be in alignment with capital T truth, right? A spiritual truth that cannot be found with the mind and logic alone, but comes through observing the essential nature of the universe, which is changeful. So, what is the I Ching, right? In very just basic terms, right? As I mentioned, it's a divination system. It involves randomly casting a series of six broken and unbroken lines into what is called a hexagram. So the basic unit of divination for the I Ching is the hexagram. Okay. And as I'm an etymology nerd, I like getting into what does the I Ching actually mean. So, right, it's commonly translated as the Book of Changes, right? Yi specifically meaning, yeah, what is both interchanging, what is flowing, but also what is revealed, right? So it refers to both the fact that the nature of the universe is change, but also that we can enact change in our own life by consulting the oracle. And that is often what the sort of divinatory spirit attached to the I Ching is called, the oracle. I really enjoy the combination of playfulness and wisdom, but also kind of brusqueness that the oracle embodies. I think it's cool that each divination technique kind of has a specific vibe and tone with which it approaches, which is very different than, say, the tarot, which is much more mercurial, much more playful. This is much more like, okay, we're getting down to the essential nature of life. And with that, right, I like that the word Jing also means like a text that has a spiritual quality. So it's saying that, right, this book of knowledge, this book of combined of collected divinatory results is itself a sacred text, and there is something holy and spiritual about interfacing it and letting it impact your life. So, like many white people in the West, I was first introduced to the I Ching through Willem Bain's translation of the I Ching, which looks like this kind of gray cover with these yellow, it's very minimal, very I'd say dry translation of the book. And with that, there's also this really cool introduction by Carl Jung on the I Ching, and he's kind of taking the very like Western approach of like, it's not actually spiritual. It has to do with chance and synchronicity, but also like isn't synchronicity, right? The idea that things occurring at the same time happening at in the same place at the same time, having some relationship to each other, that in and of itself to me is a very spiritual concept. Right. So here he's saying that basically what the I Ching does is it kind of plays with or works against the more sort of causal relationship of A equals B equals C that the Westmore takes, and says that things just occurring in the same space as each other, right, have a relationship, right? So how that, plays out with the I Ching divination is the only criterion of the validity, first of all, of the synchronicity is the observer's opinion that the text of the hexagram amounts to a true rendering of his psychic condition, right? So the proof is in the pudding, right? So it doesn't make sense logically that flipping coins a few times should yield a result that is relevant to the big question on your mind. But again and again, right, through my direct experience and through sharing it with friends, it is true, right? But it is assumed that the fall of the coins or the result of the division of the bundle of yarrow stalks is what it necessarily must be in a given situation, inasmuch as anything happening in that moment belongs to it as an indispensable part of the picture. And I just love this idea of like, right, everything around you in this very moment is connected to you and is somehow creates a language, a symbolic language that if you know how to read into it, can yield wisdom. And so the I Ching is that symbolic language, saying that if you right cast this I Ching in this moment, it will give you the answer to your question in that moment. And so just to get a little heady and meta about this and how like, because my whole thing is the I Ching is basically teaching us the fundamental truth of how the universe works. Come back to this conversation I was having with River, a friend of mine, about organic chemistry. And I love talking with River about science because she is never condescending and always explains things so well. And I was kind of just going off on my humanities tint about like, I never really like, organic chemistry was never really compelling to me because it's like, how do you take these fundamental, these few handful of elements, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And I'm supposed to believe that these few, not that interesting things can make a bunch of different things and that I'm supposed to care about. And then I was like, oh, wait, that is basically what the I Ching is, right? It's fundamentally the interaction of yin and yang, of active and receptive in specific combinations that then creates the hexagram. And the same thing is true of the carbon atom. And the thing that really got me that River was explaining to me is the reason carbon is so important and is the basis for all life is that it has 8 spots in its electron shell. It has 4 that are always filled and 4 that can be filled. So there's a fundamental balance in the structure of carbon. So it can chill on its own and be completely stable, right? Having 4 empty, right? Kind of being in this state of yin. But then it can also take in 4 other electron shells. It can join and change into something else and then become all of these other things. And so something about this thing that is fundamentally receptive, but also stable and then can change just felt like, I don't know, the I Ching is just uncovering just again and again, just these fractals of this is the way the universe is. It's just opposites becoming each other, opposites flowing together and being on this continuum together. And yeah, and that just felt like a profound moment of like, okay, maybe I should care about organic chemistry more. And it also speaks to right the power of the binary here. So so as I said, the divinatory results of the I Ching is made up of a series of broken and unbroken lines. The broken ones corresponding to yin and the earth element, unbroken associated with yang and heaven, And as Benebell describes, yin is a receptive, occulted, dark force of nature, whereas yang is assertive, right? Exoteric, apparent, and a light force of nature. And allegedly, what we first hear about these powers of the yin and yang coming together around 2600 BC with these kind of folk heroes called Fuji, and Nuwa, who are like kind of a husband and wife team. And they're often depicted as these beings with two snake bodies that are intertwined. And so, yeah, once again, these opposites coming together. And so, going back to the scientific metaphor, you can also see the yin and yang as right the positive charge of protons and the negative charge of electrons. Right, these two opposing forces coming together again is the basis for everything. Right, and with that, right, these opposites are not so different, but they are complementary, mutually formative, never inert, always in a state of transformation. The reciprocal interaction of yin and yang is called the Tao, right, or the way. And I like this series of characteristics that she has set up for yin and yang because it also, really groks with, my understanding of sect in astrology, the nocturnal and the diurnal, where the yin is very much nocturnal, what is dark, what is occulted, what is esoteric, the spirit realm, but also the underworld, right? What is shadowy, what is based on feeling and sensation and bodily sensation, rather than yang, which is right light of the mind, being able to see with the power of the sun, right, canonical too, right? There's something very established, right? This is really useful, this is legible, and this is actionable. I mean, yeah, in many ways, yin and yang is very much the same as like day and night in astrology. But then even within that, right, speaking to the changeful nature of yin and yang, right, there's actually two different types, right? When you put two of these broken or unbroken lines together, you get what is called elder yin and yang and younger yin and yang, right? So as they transform into one another, there exists, right, pure yin and yang, right, which is the elder form of it. And then there is one that is changeful, right? Yang that is about to become yin, right? Active that is about to become receptive. And that is called the younger lines. And then from that, you can then add another broken or unbroken line to elder yin and yang. And that's where you get what is called the trigrams, right? The three lines that are then the next building block of the I Ching. So, for example, right, so if you go elder yang, right, which is two unbroken lines, and then you add a yin line beneath that, you get the trigram for wind. If you take two receptive yin lines, an elder yin, and you add another yin line, you get earth. And these are the elements that really, really fascinated me, right? Because I mean, even just if you approach a hexagram from its trigram, it's so beautiful, right? Mountain over water, wind over thunder, fire over lake, right? All of us have fundamental feelings and associations when we hear that. And before Benebell's book, I'd never really seen these elements addressed in their naked form as, what does water mean on its own outside of its particular hexagrams? What are its core qualities? What does it mean to embody it? And also, like, what does it mean to practice with these, right? I mean, you can call these, these 8 elements of Taoist metaphysics, right? They're kind of akin to, our Western, 4 classical elements. I also love that, they're also called the Bagua, which translates to the 8 revelations, right? There's knowledge to be found in studying each and every one of these. And yeah, I think I explained all that. And then I just like this idea too that comes from my friend Chris Gabriel, who's currently writing a series on the I Ching, where he says that the 3 lines become a visual poem to contemplate, right? So, as we get into the, trigrams, right, for Earth, right, we see 3 receptive lines, which other people compare to like an untilled like field of soil, right? Or the trigram for fire, which I think is right here, right? It's literally like 2 flames engulfing a piece of wood. And that's something that I like about the I Ching too, is you have these like official divinations for these hexagrams, but then you can break them down into these granular parts that, each, you can spend so much time contemplating them. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about these trigrams because I think they're really cool. There's a lot you can do with them. They have correspondences. As you can see, you can kind of embody these trigrams as well or partake in certain activities that can be part of how you interact with your divinatory result as well. Is that if your position corresponds with heaven, for example, right, you can do things that correspond with that trigram, right? So the name that Benebell gives for heaven is the virtuoso. Heaven is three unbroken lines akin to a clear, bright sky, right, where everything is illuminated. And the chi quality that she associates with this trigram is the naturally occurring creative force that asserts itself. Right? There's something very actionable and powerful about heaven, but very much like you are like in alignment, like with the truth of things, right? With heaven itself, right? So there's divine inspiration, ingenuity, innovation, right? That stroke of genius is very much like, the realm of heaven, as well as like, asking for help from the spirits, and tuning to the divine, right? Makes sense for this trigram. And then people who sort of embody the heaven trigram are elders, seniors, leaders, right? Those who have gravitas and experience, no small amount of wisdom, as well as those in elevated positions, right? Like celebrities, aristocracy, those who are kind of have a glow, an untouchability, a divine tinge to them, as well as just anyone who, right, has integrity, who's also kind of ethereal, exudes power and prestige, as well as clarity of mind. And I like that, we also have some object correspondences. We have mirrors, jade, a circle, right? Things that, right, reflect clearly, improve chi. That is, I'm actually wearing my jade right now. Just, there's this belief in China that even just wearing jade is supposed to increase the effectiveness of your magical workings. And then, yeah, it's a potent creative force. It is characterized by active yang energy, clarity of intent, and continuous movement, right? When you are moving from the place of heaven, you are moving with decisive, clear action. Okay, next we have earth, right? What is fundamentally yin and receptive, or as Benebell calls it, the enchanter. So you can see it like an open, fertile field or the dark void, right? Literally the opposite of staring up at the heavens. And so, with that, Earth is very much about taking care of oneself on the material plane. Earth brings forth healthy, loving relationships, but it can also connect us to the underworld, right? Anything that is considered chthonic. Um, and so we also get things like flower baskets, cauldron, right? Woven textiles, right? Things that you're really in the marketplace, you're using your hands, you're in your body, and bringing forth beauty from that point of view, right? There, the earth trigram, and it doesn't just feel like an open field, it feels like a field of like flowers, right? And celebrating and really being in the details of this earth, of this life, right? Not looking upwards, but looking inwards. And thus it makes people who, on one hand, can maybe be more frail and passive because they're very receptive to elements around them. But it can also make, yeah, people who are nurturing, easygoing, right? You have farmers and mothers and queens as sort of earth people, as well as the masses, right? That in that way, the earth is very lunar in that it's associated with not those who are, unique and elevated, but, the ways that we're like everyone else. So it is nurturing, adaptable, and gives form to creativity by providing the fertile ground from which life emerges, right? So I feel like earth just, yeah, it just feels like you have a lump of clay to shape, right? You're not in the realm of ideals, but you're in the realm of tangibility and working therein. Okay, next we have fire, the philosopher. So we have this is younger yang, with another yang line attached. So turning into yin, but still supported by a very strong active clarity. And in this sense, fire is very much like the sun, right? It is illuminating, it is inspiring. The fire is often called the clinging, right? It brings things towards it, with a certain amount of charisma, with a certain amount of warmth. Fire is the trigram I associate with Regulus, the fixed star Regulus, for those who study the fixed stars. And in that sense, right, there is this celebrity to fire, right? Leaders and, those worthy of consult are often represented by fire because there's a strong intelligence too, right? This is kind of taking the illuminating power of heaven, right, of yang force, and then doing something with it, right, bringing other things towards it and consuming it, for this one particular goal. And so, yeah, there's also, a strong, intelligent quality to it as well, right? Quick learners, those who, are, can grok things and the meaning of things very quickly and then move out to act on it. But then fire is also very much about clarifying, right? And cutting away what is not true, getting to the bare heart of things, right? And so that's why you have a sword as, a common fire emblem. Like I think the bodhisattva associated with this trigram is Manjushri, who's the bodhisattva wisdom, who carries a blade which is used to then cut away delusions. And so, right at illumination, it represents illumination, clarity, passion, and the brilliance of truth. It represents the spark that sheds light on hidden matters. Okay. And then we have the opposite here. We have water, which Benebell calls the healer. And my friend Chris pointed out is that it literally looks like water, right? Dissolving something within it, right? Here we are entering the abyss. This is not, the cute, cuddly version of water that we get with lake. This is water as the depths of the ocean, as Megan Thee Stallion calls it, monster soup, right? We don't know what's there, right? We can't know what's there until we enter it, but there is deep occult knowledge to be found if we traverse the depths, right? So at its core, water is receptive isn't the quite right word. It's like you surrender to it. You are not in control. And I associate this trigram with Fomalhaut, which is very much the royal fixed star having to do with like working on behalf of the people. And something I've really found with water is like you kind of just have to be in the murk and the chaos, right? You're not, as opposed to fire where it's all about clarity. It's like there's deep, like what water is here to show you can only be found by entering the darkness. But interestingly, it's also associated with healing, right? This sense of coming into wholeness. If fire shaves away, water brings us back to the whole in this sort of like mysterious, unconscious way. And I like that some of the people associated with water are like people in their 20s or 30s, like when you're first really like leaving the nest and coming into adulthood, and you're like, who the hell am I? How am I supposed to do this? I don't know. I'm probably going to mess up a bunch of times, but through continued effort, I can maybe gain some clarity, some sense of who I am amidst this morass. And I like a dark mirror here, as opposed to the clear mirror of heaven, right? There's very much this like deep knowledge, esoteric scrying quality as well. Water people just feel very much like Pisces to me, where it's like they're not always sure what's going on, but if you talk to them enough, like they'll roll out a prophecy or two. And so, with that, it highlights the strength found in adaptability and honest confrontation of the unknown. Often, when you are represented by water, you just kind of have to sit in some confusion. So then we have mountain, the alchemist, which, that's sort of two yin lines on top of a yang line, sort of mimics, right, a shrouded mountain with the peak emerging from the clouds, right? And so it's essentially, right, made of earth. It's essentially receptive, but there's a stillness and there's a stability to mountain. I mean, when I think of the mountain trigram, I just think of meditation, right? Of continually returning to stillness, returning to the body. And through that stability and that continual return, right, deeper spiritual truths can come out. Right. So I think it's interesting that this trigram is associated with excelling in ceremonial magic, right? Having the skills to set things up to then, create a container for spirit to come through. So, right. So when we're channeling mountain, we're channeling, right, a stillness that is trying to make space for what is changeful and dynamic. And so, right, you have people at their peak of life, someone who has a certain amount of stability and assurance, right? Plenty of skills, right? You have very like structurally thinking people like builders, architects, geologists, historians, and archaeologists are mountain people. Um, but there's also this very interesting like rhythmic quality to mountain as well. So this fish drum mentioned here is something called a makugyo. In Zen monasteries, when you are chanting, this thing called the makugyo is keeping time. It's telling you like the speed with which you should be chanting, and something about that thing of like this is the measurement, and you're following that along through time feels very mountain to me, right? So it's, Chinese name is Gen, right? So it embodies stillness, reflection, and restraint. It is the energy that knows when to pause and to conserve resources. So often when mountain comes up, it's a time of stillness, right? In a way that's, not as chaotic as water, but remember, we're still dealing with two receptive lines and one active line. But here it's like there's much more stability to be found in this stillness or in this waiting than water. Okay, and then we have wind, right? The trigram of the shaman. So here we have elder yang, right? And essentially active force in alignment with heaven. But then below it is you add a yin line, right? So there's something, heavenly about wind, but it's going to be much more receptive and gentle. That is often its name in translations. The wind is the gentle, right? And so you can see the trigram as wind moving through the branches of the tree. And the real summary I have for wind is I don't even have it. Is gentle force, right? These are people who influence not through being like, this is what I want you to do, but through networking, through suggestion, through charm, right? Through people skills. So wind people, right? You'll see in the corporate legal professions as well as right those who right use their mind. Wind is a pretty insightful trigram as well. So teachers, educators, innovators, idea people, but those who may not be equipped to execute those ideas, right? It's very like air signs, it's in a sort of stereotypical way. They're not necessarily good on the follow through, but they'll brainstorm the hell out of things with you. Um, so they're known for, their power is known for its adaptability as well as just being generally agreeable. They want to get along with people, and wind often, encourages you to be social and to move towards something happening but not being too forceful with it. um so we see things that build and structure but also connect, right? Like the telephone or the architect, or wood, right, is a really good wind thing, right? Because it's structural but it's also supple and changeable. And so wind, or jun, also symbolizes subtle influence, gradual permeation, and the power of adaptability. It works through gentle persuasion rather than force. Okay, then we have the trigram for lake, which is also the trigram for warrior. And so here we have what to me very much looks like a placid surface over a deep contained body of water, right? It's initially very receptive, but beneath it, right, are these very strong, active yang lines. And so lake is often called the joyous, right? This is very much a place of joyful relating in a way that feels like kind of like Scorpio at its best, of like when two people come together and their merging helps them grow in a way that them on their own could not. But then, of course, with that, there can also be mutual destruction. Um, and I think it's interesting that this trigram that is very much associated, right, with exchange of energy, nourishing, sustaining force, mutual joy, is also very much the warrior archetype, right? So this is the trigram I associate with the royal star Antares. And it all has to do with like the composure of being a warrior, of being someone who's effective, does not announce yourself immediately as the warrior, does not try to start fights, but has like a placid, stoic disposition on the outside. And then when they need to act, they go and they act. And so you can see the embodiment of lake in young children, in the guileless, innocent relating, right, between, two children. As well as, yeah, those who wish to not just provide hospitality to others, but those who, use their mind, right? You can kind of see it's like there's a lot to explore in the depths of the lake. And, generally, right, while it still creates generally happy, charismatic people, I think it's this does not take criticism well. Is interesting. It's like they want to relate in a good way, and when people can't do that, then lake can have an issue. So lake ideally on its own represents joyous exchange, but it's when it's combined with other maybe less sociable hexagrams can often be like what is blocking that exchange, what is blocking that mutual joy. So we have things like silver, ornamentals, light metals, and the harvest, right? So yeah, lake is that time where you're like, yeah, gathering the fruits of what you have built and then preparing for the next cycle as well. So lake or dwi embodies joy, open communication, and pleasure. It represents the energy of delight and emotional harmony. So I realize I have not created a slide for the eighth one, which is thunder, but luckily I know thunder very well, so I can just discuss it off the cuff. Right, so thunder here, right, is represented by elder yin with a yang line. And so there is something fundamentally receptive about thunder, but it's also known for then like creating decisive action, right? It's very earthly, like its kind of fundamental energy is like to initiate action. Like one of its magical object associations is like the clapper, right? Kind of like, so my dog is right here and she just jolted awake. Like that feeling is thunder of like, you got to get shit done and you have to do it now. And so I really associate thunder with the royal star Aldebaran, right? Thunder corresponds with the east. It's about beginnings, initiating action, arousing. And one of my favorite lines about thunder that Benebell says is that it's division with the intent to unite. How do you need to break apart or do your own thing to make something happen for the sake of the whole, right? Thunder is ultimately, yeah, like very, very earthy, very embodied. But then, okay, how do you take this a potential earthy energy and then do something and channel something with it and make something change in this earthly world? Okay. So in addition to these eight elements, we also have the five Wu Jing or the five phases of change. And these five movements, right, express the five phases of energy as it transforms into matter. And they also answer the question of what drives changing lines? What propels movement from one hexagram to another, right? Why is it that the moment we're born, we're not just given one hexagram and we deal with that our whole life? Well, it's because of the right fundamental nature of things to move. And these five phases of change give us the sequence and give us the quality of this movement. And so, right, these are also five Chinese elements. You've probably seen them, like if you do Chinese astrology, right? You're not just born in the year of the rooster, right? You're an earth rooster or you're a metal rooster. And each of them have, yeah, certain qualities. And they're also, yeah, have a specific role in the sequence of change. So the first step is wood, right? The energy of sprouting and beginning. The next is fire, right? The blooming and expanding of that beginning. Earth is how you, right? The stabilizing and right coming back into right the material into the practical. And then the fourth is metal, right? The energy of extinguishing, right? Harvesting, collecting, destroys, right? But what needs to be sustained or carried on for the next phase. And then finally water, right? The energy of returning. This is stillness, contracting, and coldness, right? It's basically like when one thing ends and then also is becoming something else. And I like here that so all of these charts come from Benebell's book. She also compares these five Wu Jing like to the arc of a narrative, right? The wood is the first turning of opportunity, of growth, right? A new thing enters the consciousness of the protagonist. Next is fire, right? Awakening, expanding, pushing boundaries, enthusiasm for life, right? And then earth is where things, there's a stability, right? We've changed and now we're kind of getting used to the lay of the land. And then the fourth is, yeah, something is coming to attack that, and we have to defend this new thing. We have to see how do you actually maintain it, while also knowing maybe some things need to be unraveled or dismantled. And then fifth is, right, the calm at the end of the storm, but also, yeah, you becoming something else. The real change is integrated after the ups and downs. And I also think this is interesting. Each of the trigrams is also corresponds to a certain of these wujings, and each of these wujings also correspond to a specific divine art. So lake and heaven are of the element metal, and they correspond with the study of fate. So this would be like the study of our natal charts is very much the study, the metal divinatory art. And then fire, right, corresponds with fire, and that's divinatory art, and that's more prediction, right? So that's going to be horary, or, oh, you're in danger immediately, right? Versus this is the web of your fate forever. Water corresponds with water, and that is the healing art. And that is not just like physical healing, but anything that kind of brings us back into wholeness, like soul retrieval or something like that. And then wind and thunder correspond to wood, right? What is sprouting. And that has to do with spiritual cultivation, which is literally like meditation, qigong, right? Anything that sort of gathers, right, the qi force, the energy to then, make decisions, do with what you will. And then earth and mountain correspond with the earth element and the study of appearances. And that is both geomancy, but it's also things like face reading and palm reading and correspondences, like natural magic, like looking at a stone or plant and being like, these are its magical elements based on its appearance. So one way of working with any of these trigrams, especially if they come up in a reading, is to study one of these particular divinatory arts. Okay. So to then make an official I Ching divinatory result, you take two of these trigrams and you stack them on top of each other, right? So at the most fundamental level, when you endeavor to interpret an hexagram, you are assessing the alchemical functions of the yin and yang lines. That is how the different combinations of yin and yang forces in nature are being transmuted. So you're both looking at this one, for example, as wind over mountain, but you're also looking at how many yin and yang lines, how are they sequenced, right? How do they come together, and how to, what does each line sort of represent on its own? And from, from these combinations of two trigrams, right, there are 64 total permutations of yin and yang. So when you're doing the I Ching, you're getting one of 64 potential divinatory results. So how do you cast a hexagram? There are many methods. The most classic method is a specific sequencing involving 50 yarrow stalks. When I first learned, I was taught on bamboo skewers, but I'm trying to make my own yarrow stock set. So until that happens, I'm going to use either probably the coin method or the rice grain method. So the coin method is very simple. All you need are 3 coins. I recommend having 3 particular coins that you use for this purpose, that you put on an altar somewhere sacred. Don't just put them into your wallet or coin purse. And then basically you flip these 3 coins 6 times. And based on those coin flips, you either get a series of yin and yang lines. But it's worth noting, when you have 3 tails or 3 heads, you get what's called a changing line, which means that it will then, you cast the first hexagram, and then you note the changing lines, and then you cast a second hexagram, switching, right, a changing yin for a yang. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say. And another thing to note is when you're casting for the I Ching, it goes from the bottom to the top. And so the first line, so say you get 3 tails as your first line, that is the bottom line. The second one, and then the final line is the top line. Hopefully that is not too confusing. And then this is another method that Benebell teaches that I like, which is a rice grain method, where you take about a cup of uncooked rice. She specifically says no unbroken pieces. And then you just scoop up a random spoonful. You count the number of grains, and then you divide by 8. And then the remainder corresponds to a specific hexagram. So if the remainder is 4, then the first hexagram is thunder. And then scoop up another one and say the remainder is 7, right? Then the second hexagram is mountain. So you get mountain over thunder. If you want to read for changing lines, you would then scoop up another number of rice grains, you would count them, and then you would divide it by 6. And whatever remainder you get is the corresponding line. Okay. So to show you how to interpret a hexagram, I asked the I Ching what hexagrams does the I Ching want us to study together. So here we have number 47, which then turns into number 59. So you'll see here, if we wait, starting from the bottom, where we have we have a yin line, a yang line, and a yin line. This is the trigram for water. And then we have 2 yang lines and a yin line, right? So we have lake over water. And then because we have 2 changing lines, right? This yang line becomes yin and this yin line becomes yang. So then we have yin, sorry, I did this poorly. So then we have thunder. No, this is no mountain. No, this is wind. Okay. Right. So we have yin, yang, yin, yang, yin. So we have then water over wind. So we have lake over water that turns into wind. No, not wind. Sorry. Water over wind. I really made that complicated for myself. Okay. So there's 2 ways primarily of interpreting the hexagrams, 2 traditions in China. The first is called the meaning in principle tradition. And this is usually how I Ching is approached in the West, right? It is very philosophical. It is very textual, relies primarily on the study of literary texts and etymology to arrive at the hexagram's meaning. It asks that you study as many different texts and translation as possible. The I Ching, you can definitely have your favorite translations, but this method really encourages you to read around. And it also includes studying the text in its oral form and studying the emotional affect of its rhythms and sounds. So here you're kind of approaching the I Ching like you would a literary analysis, right? And you're using the direct advice from the text to interpret the meaning. So for example, number 47, the hexagram we cast before, is called blockade, right? And the 2 changing lines are 3 and 4. And so you'll find that the way that these texts are set up is that there is a judgment or a paragraph where the oracle, gives you kind of like the main meaning of the text. And then there's commentary, usually done by an author, sort of breaking down and giving you more detail on the oracle or the judgment. And then each of these 6 lines within the hexagram has its own interpretation as well that gives you a more specific delineation that you're looking for. So, someone else could, get number 47 as the result. But if, they're reading for line 1 versus line 4, that's going to give a different slant to how that plays out. So just to give you a taste, I'm going to read, this is Benebell's translation of the oracle for 47 blockade. She says, ambitions hit a wall. Feeling exhausted and worn down, you are overwhelmed, unable to cope with your feelings of entanglement. Barriers of entry to the next level of advancement. Forces cause you to become isolated, closed off, and surrounded. Obstruction of passage and progress. A state of inner oppression. In the darkness, you do not yet see how the restraining bonds can be broken. First, do not let external forces restrain you. Restrain yourself. Control what you can control. Cultivate an inner strength that becomes an outer strength, and you can shatter the iron hand that is otherwise holding you back. And I just really find this form of divination so interesting, right? Because it's telling you both, like, this is the situation, this is the difficulties, and here is how to best move through them, right? There's just so much wisdom. And we can look even further at the etymology, right? For the Chinese name for this hexagram, right? It's the ideogram for wood, right? Symbolic of growth and prosperity, boxed in and surrounded, right? This is the chi force that is besieged with difficulty. So literally, like you're trying to act, right? But you're from without, you're blocked. And I liked here, Benebell often gives prescriptions, and she says that when hexagram 47 comes up, increase wood chi in your surroundings. And there's specific colors, foods, stones, activities, weather, times of day that correspond with wood. So it's as simple as just like bringing those things into your home can also help move through this blockade. And, similarly, she says here that hexagram 47 was traditionally used in baneful magic to blockade someone and prevent that person from achieving prosperity or advancement. So here it's also saying there might be someone acting against you and hemming you in, and be aware that it's not your fault, but you have to somehow figure out how to create your own fortification. But it's really through studying these texts and the meaning of the lines as well to give you an even more nuanced interpretation. Right. So here we have, right. And I kind of see like the different lines. Like I kind of go back and forth of like, is line 3 a specific path that you take? And then line 4 is its own specific path versus they each kind of come together and are both kind of happening in this particular instance, right? So line 3 says, trapped among the high rocks, a rugged, rocky terrain, surrounded by thorns and thistles. Returning, man enters his palace but cannot find his wife. It is foreboding, right? So Benebell adds that if your divinatory result is the third line, it should be an indication that extenuating forces beyond your control or that have been maliciously cast on you are causing stagnation in your progress. So in some ways, line 3 is just sort of further, what am I saying? Further enforcing what the main judgment says. And then line 4 has a slightly different view, right? Slow passage homeward, trapped in a golden carriage. Adversity, yet there will be an ending to that adversity, right? So it's still saying, there's going to be difficulties journeying forward. And while it may not feel like there is an end in sight, it will come to its cessation, right? So ultimately, this is going to say there's a blockade, but there's movement. There is space that will eventually bring you to where you want to go. Just know that the delays are part of the process. And then after that, we have the second hexagram, right, that the changing lines then create. And this is sort of seen depending on, how you interpret it as a sort of if then, right? After this, first prognostication is done, it will then turn into this. And yeah, there's some debate as if that is just what is naturally going to happen, or if you do things the way you're supposed to, right, then this is going to happen. But sometimes, right, you have a really nice first hexagram and then a harder second hexagram. And so I think it just brings up a lot of question of like, is that inevitable that you just to embrace that? Or is that then something to watch for, right? There's an excess maybe involved in that. And here you can always just read the oracle for the second hexagram, which I also realized is, so it's not called 47 making waves. It is called 59 making waves. Okay. Don't mind me. So what is this second hexagram, right? A very important task is at hand. And to make waves, you will be the driver of the forces. Like wind breaking waves, right? Because this is literally wind over water. A voice of reason, virtue, and compassion rises to reform what is broken and severe. Omen of one with a strong sense of purpose who understands exactly what must be done to make waves and create necessary change. Set aside personal interest and pursue public interest. Heaven seeks you as a vessel to carry forth its mission. Dispel what has been oppressive. Honor the gods and ancestors to receive further insight, prayer, petitions, meditation, and music. And so kind of seeing these as a pair, the first thought I have is you kind of needed to go through these difficulties and these blockages to then, right, take on this essential influence that making waves is speaking to, right? It's very much speaking to someone, casting their powers far and wide. And I like here, you see this phrase, right? The wind, blah, blah, blah. Auspicious to cross the great stream. There are some phrases that you'll see again and again in the oracle, like one is no blame or inauspicious to cross the great stream. But basically, when you see this phrase, it means that there will be difficulties, but it is full steam ahead on the undertaking you are doing. Like keep going. Like it is divinely ordained. And then I like this: who you are is what you create in this world, a favorable omen. Um, yeah, so that is how most people, how I primarily read the I Ching for a lot of time, is referring to the texts. But then there's what's called the image and number tradition, which is much more esoteric and much more about the analysis of correspondences. Things like the number of the hexagram, the idea that, right, a hexagram assigned to 64 versus 33, right? Those numbers also hold, insight to its meaning. Trigram correspondences. So this is going to get much more into what, if you have the trigram wind, right? Look to, right, the people and the qualities and the times of day corresponding to it to give you insight into your interpretation, as well as what's called the chi of each line. So as you can see here, each line of the hexagram has an innate chi. All of the odd lines are innately yang. All of the even lines are innately yin. And you will see that different lines will be inauspicious or auspicious depending on if they align with that. So you'll see here that you can, I would assume that the first line for this hexagram, because it is yin and thus out of sync with its essential chi, is going to have more friction to it, is not going to be as stable as the fifth line, right, which corresponds to the innate chi of line 5. You'll also see, right, look at yin yang dominance, right? How many broken versus unbroken lines are in this hexagram? And then you also look to what's called the hexagram ruler. So line 5 of each hexagram is seen as sort of like the distilled meaning and ultimate result of the act. And so usually this tradition might not even use changing lines, or even if they do, we'll always read the divinatory result for line 5 as well. So that's also something to look for if you're using this form of interpretation. And it tends toward abstracting the 6 lines and taking a more rationalist approach, but also stems from this belief that numbers reveal the divine. So it's kind of like being a nerd to like have like kind of deep insights from these like esoteric correspondences. So looking at, this is the right hexagram for blockade. Is that correct? Yes. So here we have lake over water. So we would look at both, right, the correspondences for lake as well as water. We see here that, like, in terms of essential power, right, there's a balance between yin and yang. There's 3 and 3 of both. So there's a mix of activity and receptivity when dealing with this. We see that most of the lines are younger, right, in the sense of you can calculate this by, right, putting the lines of the hexagram next to the innate chi. So then, right, line 1 is younger yin, line 2 is younger yang. But with that, because most of the lines are younger and thus changing, this is going to be a more unstable hexagram, right? So you can expect when you pull this that things are up in the air, things are outside of your control, and, right, a lot is changing into something else. And then you also see, like, you'd also look at the element corresponding with each. Right, so here we have, wait, that doesn't make any sense. So here we have water on the bottom and we have metal on top, right? Water corrodes metal, right? So kind of like the fundamental quality of lake of joining and coming together is degraded or washed away by the influence of the water element. And then, so the upper trigram often represents the environment that you're placed within. And so that would be, right, of lake, mutual exchange and joy, nourishing and sustaining forces, winning legal disputes. But who you are is represented by the lower trigram, right? So while you're trying to just like be in relationship, right, that you are embodying this element of danger, of risk, of the unknown, of occult knowledge, as well as just like shape shifting. So it's like this, you can kind of see this is essentially a very unstable hexagram, and one that, you know, makes sense that this is called blockade. Particularly all the lines of the lower trigram are unstable. They are opposing, they're the antithetical to the innate chi of this you know, of these, of this position. And so, and yeah, it's very much pointing to who you are in this moment is very unstable and unreliable. And while, you know, there might be forces outside of you or that are stabilizing you, they can also be like hemming you in, they can be imprisoning you. Okay. uh Another way of reading the lines in the image and number tradition is each line corresponds with certain topics. So if you're reading for short-term or money matters, you would look to line 1 in this hexagram. If you're looking for romantic or love advice, you'd look to line 4. But as I said, the line 5 will always be relevant as sort of like the main crux of the hexagram. So the 5th line for number 47 for blockade is cutting off the nose, cutting off the feet, bound by the vermilion sash, speak with poise, calm and steady, a quiet tone, and thus shall there be progress. Favor is granted after the ceremonial offering. So it's basically saying the crux of this is like, you know, things are unstable, right? Things are moving around, but there's little things you can do, right? Maintaining your composure, not acting too swiftly, and turning towards the gods, right? Turning towards the unknown in penance and offering to then bring you guidance when the moment is right. Right. So it's saying, you know, regardless, you know, there's punishment, there's some sense of being hemmed in and blocked. But if you take your time, if you appeal your case and stay calm, right, there can be progress that comes forward. So that is the main crux of the class. This is how I teach the I Ching, or this is how I interpret them. Honestly, the image and number stuff is like, I feel like that is taking some time to really sink in, to just, there's so many different correspondences and little pieces of information to hold in. But I think it's just a matter of, you know, starting out with things that feel compelling to you. Like instead of just immediately running toward the text, if you get water over fire, right, contemplate that. What, you know, where in nature do you see water over fire? Right? What elements or what objects mean that? What does it mean to be fire, right? While your outer environment is like water, right? And use that to then get the feel for the hexagram. Though, I mean, I always love the text, so I don't think you necessarily have to choose. I think it's just knowing that both that granular approach and that very textual approach has a place in this study. And then to end, I thought it was cool of like, where else do we see the I Ching being used? In human design, right? So each of the gates that, you know, our planets are in this system correspond to a hexagram in the I Ching. And I thought it would be fun, you know, just a fun exercise is if you pull up your HG chart, look for your conscious sun gate, which you will see here is on the right-hand side, next to the sun icon. It's the first number here. So this is the human design chart for Kurt Cobain. So his conscious sun line is hexagram, corresponds to hexagram 55, which is called opulence. Honors bestowed. There is progressive movement and there is clarity in the mind. You are a position of great influence. You rise like the sun at the highest point in the sky. Be mindful when abundance becomes opulence. When abundance becomes opulence, the king will fall. Every age of enlightenment comes to a decline. A period of tremendous power is upon you. Embrace the tides of change, come what may. If you know the life of Kurt Cobain, I'd say that this opulence, this decline, this decay, all of that very much fits into like his central identity archetype, right? And you can ideally, you can do this for all of your placements, but the sun is always a good place to start. And just shows you like there's so many different ways to use the I Ching. You can cast a hexagram being like, what element should I study, right? You can, yeah, you can, there's so many different correspondences. I really recommend getting the Benebell Wen book. But just know that, yeah, for as many ways that we can change, the I Ching can also change with us. So hopefully this gives you some ideas and some inspiration to start tossing some coins for yourself.